Hello, welcome again to our webinar on current transformations of democracy. I have the great honor to introduce our guest. As you know, it's John Keane. John Keane is a professor at the University of Sydney. I'm incredibly thankful to you, John, because I know you had to wake up extremely early. It's 5 o'clock at the other side of the world. It's in the evening here in Central European time, so we're doubly thankful. First, because as is well known, John Keane is one of the utmost experts in democratic theory. He's the one who coined the term monitoring democracy. He has, I guess, more than a dozen books on democratic theory, and in general on political science and political theory. He'll be presenting his speech today on which has the title "A Brief History of Expertise and Its Growing Importance for Democracy." The floor is yours, John.
Well, buenas tardes a todos. Greetings from the Southern Hemisphere, where you may know it is already Thursday and our Earth is spinning nicely towards the sun. Dawn is coming. I wanted to say muchas gracias por la invitación. Special thanks to the Fundación Keane and their very expert staff, and also to Professor Fernando Vallespin, whose work I have come to know and whose work I greatly respect and learn much from. I hope he will continue to speak to me after these remarks on the topic of expertise. My subject this evening is experts, experto, and their role in a democracy, democracia. What I want to present to you is, of course, work in progress. It's something of a heuristic. It's a big, important topic that touches on a family of other terms, related terms, for example, and questions. For example, what is truth? Or what is the role and meaning of public intellectuals in these years of the 21st century? The future of universities, what is the relationship with journalism? Can we say that expertise can be housed outside of universities? I mean, all of these questions are in a way indirectly raised by what I'm about to say, but I cannot address them in any detail. And you will see that what I have to say is strongly autobiographical. It's something of a self-description. It's a summary, so to say, of my thoughts, rough thoughts about this very important topic of expertise. I want to proceed in 4 steps. First of all, I want to present to you a very brief history, what Germans would call Begriffsgeschichte, a very brief history of the key terms. I want, secondly, then, to talk about a great shift of meaning of the expert that happened during the late 1920s and early 1930s, a century ago. And in particular, I want to talk about Werner Heisenberg's redefinition of what is an expert. Third, I want to say a few words about Max Weber and his famous and influential theory about the importance of expertise, the crushing importance of expertise under modern conditions. And fourth, and finally, I want to rethink conventional understandings of expert and expertise. And I want to give you 5 reasons why experts are functionally vital for democracy, for constitutional power sharing, monitory democracies. First, a few words about the genealogy of the expert, of expertise, the whole idea. It is forgotten, I think, that it was only in the 19th century that the words expert and expertise underwent a transformation of meaning. The expert came to mean someone who was in a way a replacement for the priest, someone, a godlike figure who was the carrier of truth, of knowledge. And this replacement, this transformation, this redefinition of the expert, which is now familiar to us, replace a much older, originally in the European tradition, medieval understanding of expertise. To speak of expertise in earlier times was to speak of, or an expert was to speak of someone who was skillful, wise in their grasp of a subject, who was experienced. From root terms, we get the idea of expert, for example, from the Latin experire, to try or to attempt a task. And this understanding of the expert as someone experienced was not, it did not mean experience in the sense of feelings, but rather the expert was someone who was wise because they had engaged in repeated trials of a subject. That is, they had experimented, they had experience in experimentation, and thereby had a definite wisdom about some matter in the world. This understanding of this older understanding of the expert as someone experienced in the world, as someone who is wise, cautious, who has learned from their own foolishness, is an understanding of expert and expertise that I want to retrieve in this lecture. I want to recover this and reconstruct it, but it was replaced, as I've mentioned, in the 19th century. And it was replaced, interestingly, at the time that the struggle for one person, one vote, the struggle for the universal franchise, came to be an animating theme, for example, in the Atlantic region, but also in Spanish America. And the objection to expertise was exactly this, that Democrats were hostile towards expertise because, and experts, because they, Democrats, believed in leveling, in equalizing life chances. And therefore, the presumption was that expertise and democracy don't mix, like oil and water. The very idea of the expert as someone who was a monopolist of knowledge was actually an insult to democracy, because either everybody is an expert or because nobody is an expert. This kind of objection to the expert as the custodian, as the monopolist of knowledge, of course, we hear today. Populism is a great objection to the complexity of the world. It wants willfully to simplify things, and therefore we have examples. Bolsonaro currently waging a campaign in Brazil against vaccination, who likes to say in his press conferences and speeches, you know, go ahead and be vaccinated, but if you wake up tomorrow morning as a crocodile, you know, don't blame me. I warned you that the experts are deceiving you. Or There was famously in 2015 a very well-spoken former Lord High Chancellor, Michael Gove, who in a very upper-class accent in the build-up to the UK referendum on leaving Europe, said, people in this country have had enough of experts. This was headlines, and it expressed this populist refusal of expertise. And this refusal of expertise, this democratic refusal of expertise, of course, has much deeper roots that go back to the originally Platonic view that democracy, democratia, is ignorant government. Plato likened democracy to sailors navigating on a ship with no compass, with no attempt to orient themselves using the stars. Ignorant government. The objection was from Democrats to this Platonic view that if the Platonists got their way, then nobody would ever be able to govern themselves without a leader, that people would never sleep, get up, wash, eat, or do anything unless they took their cue faithfully from those who know better than themselves. So this is the first point, that there is a history of these key terms, that there was this older meaning of the expert as someone wise, cautious, experienced in the world, replaced during the course of the 19th century by the expert understood as the custodian, the monopolist of knowledge. Second point, it was in the 1920s and 30s that there was a noticeable challenge and a very important challenge to this 19th century and early 20th century understanding of the expert. And the reasons for this should be clear, because it was in the early decades of the 20th century, as we know well, that the expert came to be, for example, loyal to the god of totalitarian power. Many intellectuals siding with fascism or Stalinism. There was as well the willingness of medical doctors to ignore the Hippocratic oath to perform hideous experiments on victims. There was the production and organized deployment of knowledge, chemical, biological knowledge, and of course, nuclear weapons. There were terrible experiments carried out, for example, by the Americans during World War II on conscientious objectors who were taken, infested with lice, and covered with DDT, with the chemical DDT, to see what happened. It was this kind of abuse of expertise, this entanglement of expertise with arbitrary power, with abusive power, that forced a rethinking, or so I suggest, of the very meaning of expertise. And here, one example is the famous redefinition by Werner Heisenberg, the great Nobel Prize winning German physicist, who wrote in the late 1920s this: an expert is someone who knows some of the worst mistakes that can be made in their subject and who manages to avoid them. Heisenberg liked to joke about truth and knowledge, to lampoon, to make fun of the old understanding of expertise. For example, when he recalled several times that at the Copenhagen Institute, roughly 1925 to 1927, when puzzles emerged among the young scientists who were gathered, Niels Bohr and others, they liked to joke that there were two kinds of truth. There were simple truths that seemed self-evident and were difficult to contradict, and what Heisenberg called deep truths. deep truths are statements that contain self-contradictory propositions, but they are true. And this was a warning, this joke was a warning to his contemporaries that truth is not a straightforward matter, that the expert is someone who is cautious about truth. And what I suggest here is that, in fact, Heisenberg was recovering this much older understanding of the expert as an experienced thinker, as an experienced character, wise in the ways of the world, cautious, not always certain about so-called knowledge and the way things can be manipulated in this world. Third point, it was, of course, it has been the case for more than a century, going back well into the 19th century, that democracies have come to depend upon organized expertise. This is very clearly a theme of Max Weber and a disturbing theme of Max Weber. And I would like to say something briefly about his work. According to Max Weber, expertise is a component of the total bureaucratization of the modern European world. He was thinking, I suggest, in terms of the 19th century paradigm, late 19th century paradigm, early 20th century paradigm of the expert as someone who knows, who has, as Max Weber put it, knowledge of the files. What he wanted to say, to put things very simply, is that bureaucracy grows in the corporate world, in the field of state power, in military exercises, in universities, in all organizations, because of the technical efficiency, the competence, the ability to get things done of bureaucracy. Precision, I'm quoting, speed, unambiguity, knowledge of the files, continuity, discretion, unity, strict subordination, reduction of friction and of material and personal cost. Trained bureaucracy is superior on all these fronts. That is to say, Weber's worry as an anguished liberal was that the more modernity unfolds, the more bureaucracy universally grips our lives. And it does so because of its technical efficiency and effectiveness, and it is backed by expertise. Of course, those of you who know about Max Weber will know as well that Max Weber sought to protect a form of democracy against that total bureaucratization. He called it Fura democrati, a kind of plebiscitarian leader democracy. He tried to keep alive politics, multi-party politics and elections. The idea was that politics could be a resistance to the universal domination of the expert. I think there are problems with this Weber view, and it will lead me to my fourth point. The problems, briefly, that I see is that we are more aware now, after this unfinished communications, digital communications revolution, that non-bureaucratic ways of organizing to get things done can be actually more effective and more efficient. For instance, during disasters, civil society networks are capable of distributing help to people whose lives have been damaged more effectively than, for example, centralized bureaucratic organizations. Or when it comes to the transformation of public views leading up to a referendum, for example, on same-sex marriage. civil society organizations, dispersed, networked, digitally plugged in, so to say, are more effective than government bureaucracies in transforming opinions. Max Weber could not have foreseen this, but it is a major objection to his belief, his basic thesis that bureaucracies are technically more effective and efficient and therefore triumphant. I think as well, it's strange for me that Max Weber, who had read Nietzsche, who was sure that objectivity of knowledge always had a human component, that that truth in itself, that facts in themselves were to be doubted. It's strange that knowledge based on the files he took for granted, did not challenge the 19th and early 20th century view that experts are those who have secure empirical knowledge of the world. This brings me finally to my fourth point, where I want to sketch out 5 analytically connected reasons why I think expertise needs to be rethought, the role, the meaning and the role of the expert are reimagined to make sense of certain trends in these years of the early 21st century. And I want to begin in the sketch of these 5 connected reasons why the expert is compatible with, functionally a requirement of democracies by the first role, if you like, of the expert is the expert can be and should be considered as someone who is a contrarian, someone who is good at contrapuntal reasoning, someone who is a fox, as Isaiah Berlin would have put it, rather than a hedgehog, someone whom the Greeks, classical Greek democrats, would have said are good at parrhesia, bold speech, bold statements that contradict prevailing doxa, prevailing common sense. So experts are those who are against groupthink, who are against siloed reasoning. Much can be learned from the work of Daniel Kahneman, the Thinking Slow and Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow book. A beautiful statement of the role of the expert as a contrarian was presented recently in an interview with Michael Fauci, who survived the 4-year Trump administration as the chief medical officer in the United States, who said, when reflecting on his role as a man of medicine, that he tried to be throughout the Trump years and will carry on, aged 80, to be the skunk at the picnic. That is the picnic of governmental power. The role of the expert is to release smells, so to say, that are unwelcome, to say things that are contrary to the prevailing orthodoxies within the ranks of government. And this role, I would say, you can see very much at work in the statements during the great pestilence by Peter Piot, the great Belgian virologist, someone who has much to say about our virus planet, who is warning that this pestilence that we are going through is not the final pestilence, that there are likely to be more, that we do not know how many viruses there are on our planet, possibly only 5% have been mapped, and that the spread of viruses, the globalization of viruses is likely because of environmental disturbances. I mean, these kinds of statements are contrarian, and I think they very well illustrate the first important function of experts in a democracy. Democracy needs contrarians of this kind. Second, it is because of the contrarianism that experts, I want to say, contribute to the pluralization of institutions. Here, I think much can be said about the limits of a famous thesis in the 1920s by Walter Lippmann, who was the most prominent American journalist, who immediately after World War I complained about the ignorance of citizens in an increasingly complex world, and therefore called for the creation of think tanks, what he called political observatories, filled with experts who would save democracy from the ignorance of its own citizens. There are serious objections to this view, but implicit in that thesis of Walter Lippmann was the idea that actually democracies need a multiplicity of institutions, one type of which houses expertise, and therefore keep alive a definite measure of pluralism which every democracy needs. The point, the controversial point, I think, of Lippmann was, of course, that we are wiser and we know that experts should be kept on a leash. But when all things are considered, the second point is that because of their professional training, their experience, because of peer review, because of certain codes of conduct, experts bring different standards of judgment and views of the world into the corridors of power. And that is good for democracy because it helps to ensure that no body rules. And this can be illustrated in many ways. The second function, this pluralizing function of experts and expertise, with one example that you may know little or nothing about. It is the granting, for example, for the first time in the world, in the Southern Hemisphere, in New Zealand, the granting of legal status to tracts of territory, to rivers. There is a very interesting and long story about the so-called Wanganui River. It has been renamed Te Awa Tupua. It now has a legal status and it is protected by experts, both Maori and Crown experts, whose job is to protect that river against development, commercialization, state intrusion, and so on. It adds, therefore, the role, therefore, of experts in this particular case is to protect an enclave of power, so to say, a patch of territory against competitor institutions. Third reason why democracies need expertise is that they keep publics. They engage with publics and they keep publics on their toes. They cultivate wise citizens. The expert is someone who is experienced, someone who is able to communicate with a wider public. And in this sense, there is an older meaning that you may not know about among sheep shearers. Sheep shearers have used the word expert to describe usually a retired sheep shearer who is experienced, whose job is to keep the whole operation in good working order. Well, here, analogously, experts play the role of keeping, so to say, public opinion, public discussions in some kind of intelligible order. This meaning of expert as someone keeping things in order is, of course, the use of the word. The word is used by computer engineers. An expert is a code that connects a class or family of devices to an operating system. So experts have a public function. They can be soft. They can deploy expertise in a soft manner. For instance, election commissioners, election commission officers, staffed by experts whose job is to keep elections free and fair. Or another example, the first ever established office of the legislative analyst, as it's called in California, the LAO. It currently has a staff of around 56 people. What is its job? To inform the legislature about budgetary implications of proposed legislation, but also to report to citizens prior to an election of what the costs will be of competing parties' visions of the future. Expertise can take tougher forms in democracy in terms of this third function of the public. And here, the role of the expert can be to raise serious problems to publics, to fling tough questions into the public domain, to point to procedural irregularities, to cast doubts on current, let's say, government or corporate policies. Here, an example of this third function, the role of the expert as a public communicator who warns about risks. An example would be Hans Bethe. You may not know of Hans Bethe, but he was one of the central figures in the Los Alamos project that developed the so-called Fat Man bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. Later, he came to be an anti-nuclear expert who played a very central role in convincing John F. Kennedy to sign the partial nuclear test ban treaty, and later lobbied heavily Richard Nixon, who agreed to sign the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And today, this role, this public role, you can see at work in the Committee on Climate Change in the UK. Its job is to report regularly on the government's progress towards zero emissions. Fourth function, I would say implicit in so far what I've said is that the expert is someone who propagates the spirit of humility. Humility is a very important democratic virtue. The power of experts is typically temporary. The expert, so to say, gives away her or his gifts free of charge from the rich to the poor. I'm speaking figuratively here. I have in mind someone like Alice Stewart. Again, you may not know of her. She was the woman who, against tremendous institutional opposition and initial skepticism, was the first researcher, the first expert to draw the conclusion that no dose of radiation is safe. She did so by examining records of the post-World War II X-ray screening of pregnant women in the United Kingdom. Her career suffered, but she later became revered as a pioneer, researcher, expert in this field, someone who warned against the arrogance of departments of health, of governments, of businesses, and also of universities, and who in the end triumphed. Finally, I would say that the true expert is functionally important in a democracy because the true expert brings contrarianism into the ranks of experts themselves. Here I want to raise the problem of groupthink. That is to say, experts can contribute to democracy within their own ranks. I am thinking here of the problem that was raised in the work of Irving Janis on groupthink. Irving Janis, you may know, in a book called Victims of Groupthink, published in 1972, showed that the American invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, which was a disaster, was an example where groupthink set in among experts. So the importance of the work of Janis was to cast doubt on the, if I may speak in Foucault's terms, the regime of truth that can settle on the ranks of experts. Here we have subsequently lots of interesting research. I'm thinking, for instance, of Philip Tetlock's book, Expert Political Judgment, published in 2005. It's a study of 280 people who made their living on commenting or offering expert advice on political and economic matters to media. The conclusion of Tetlock is that experts are typically not good at predicting the future, that it would be better off if those experts had just said 50-50 chance, because in more than 50% of cases, they got things wrong. We know that about economists. It's true also for political scientists. So the fourth point, the fifth point is that what is needed, the true expert is the role of a true expert is to actually question orthodoxies within their own disciplinary field. I would say that I have spent much of my life casting doubts and doing disputations over research on democracy, particularly with people who concluded that, for instance, refrigerators and automobiles and a US median income of $6,000 would actually make democracy irreversible. That was a serious proposition, widely accepted some 25 years ago in the ranks of political science. I want finally to just say a few words about the overall picture that I've presented. You will notice that truth is not a word that's been used very much in these remarks. And I'm very happy to talk about that. I do believe that although the mantra of truth, references to truth are commonplace among experts of the kind that I have described, I think truth has lost its virginity. It has become controversial. I'm very happy to talk about that. But what I have tried to suggest, and thank you very much for listening, is that experts can play the role, true experts can play the role of contrarians. They are defenders of institutional pluralism. They are champions of public debate and controversy and citizens' wisdom. They are agents of humility, and they are characters who actually can prevent orthodoxies from taking grip within fields of expertise. Of course, this raises a great deal of, this line of thinking raises a great deal of difficult questions, but what I hope is that I might have persuaded you to rethink the meaning of the word expert and expertise, to understand perhaps, or even possibly to ponder more deeply the indispensable role that experts and expertise play currently and should in future play in power-sharing monitory democracies. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Thanks, John. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, perfect.
Yes, I can.
Well, let me start with a note more than a question, although I'd like to, of course, I'd like to know your opinion. And I think it has, it's based on three potential contradictions that we can find when we talk about expertise in general. There's first the contradiction between the accusation of today's politics as being extremely technocratic, understanding by that based on expert knowledge, while at the same time, I think we're witnessing an enormous developing of conspiracy theories. So we have, on the one hand, and we are experiencing this throughout the pandemic, right? So there has been a refurbishing, a re-legitimization of the experts, virologists, epidemiologists, whatever. While at the same time, in our public space, we're continuously confronted to absolute irrationality. And so how is it possible? Well, you just said, well, truth has become controversial, and I think maybe that's the reason, yeah, that people don't really trust so-called representatives of the truth, right? So that would be one part. Second part, which is related to this, is an expert the same as a technocrat, or is a technocrat simply, from what I understood from your presentation, a technocrat is rather, the Weberian sense of an expert, what Max Weber didn't like at all, right? But as you know, accusing governments of being technocratic is one of the main accusations on part of populism. And then, this would be my last point. How do experts relate to intellectuals? Because intellectuals seem to be, this probably is a contradiction in itself, seems to be experts in moralizing. So morality, I don't know if we can subject morality to a certain kind of expertise, right? I'm sorry, perhaps these are, too long, to give an adequate answer. But I just curious, to see how you would react.
Yeah, muchas gracias, Fernando. I think I'll have to be brief. On the question of conspiracy theories, I think it's very context dependent, and I would say, I have been trying to write about this in the last few months, I would say that there are at least 5 democracies where conspiracy theories have been noticeably absent or have played a very minor role. Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, and Uruguay. And what is interesting about those 5 democracies is that not only did they close borders rapidly, but there was a clear positioning of medical expertise alongside of elected government, where medical experts, very much along the lines that I sketched, would say, we don't know whether after contracting COVID-19 and recovering, there can be a recurrence. We don't know that vaccination can, we don't know the durability of vaccination, but we do know that wearing a mask is a good thing. The consequence was that the volume of lying, of bullshit, of prevarication, of gaslighting was very low in these democracies. And the consequence has been the level of social trust in the expert as doubter, as not a god who knows everything. The level of trust is high. By contrast, look at the United States. It's the antithetical case where under Trump, this kind of good government did not happen. So I would say that actually it is the absence of expertise, the weakness of expertise, that allows the proliferation of conspiracy theories. It's perhaps not the answer, Fernando, that you expected, but it does seem to me that you know, that to put it very simply, the best weapon against conspiracy theories is expertise in the senses that I sketched. I think, secondly, the expert is not a technocrat, and I think the technocrat, as you say rightly, is much better understandable in the terms of Max Weber. The technocrat has been trained professionally in some areas of economics, or let's say of law, but thinks of themselves as certain, I mean, monopolists of certain knowledge of procedural rigor. They know the best way to do things. Of course, they have internal tensions and they argue, but they do not play the five roles that I sketched. So I would say that the technocrat is a category, and technocracy is a category that stands in great tension with expertise in the way I've tried to redefine it. Intellectuals, experts in moralizing. I could say, God help us all if intellectuals are this, but
that's what they do, right?
some do and some don't. I think that it's a big discussion, but I think that, you know, Zygmunt Bauman, the Polish British sociologist, was right in his genealogy of the intellectual, a role born of the 18th century, that the intellectual was on the side of the expert and expertise in that 19th century sense. The intellectual is a know-all, a man typically who grasps the totality of things, who knows how conceptually to grasp the world, and therefore to act on the world. And not surprisingly, as Bauman pointed out, intellectuals in that sense collaborated with total power. It's a paradox, but it's entirely understandable in those terms. I happen to think that the best antidote to that arrogance, that expertise in moralizing with a capital M, that the best antidote is expertise in the sense that I sketched it. So I may be completely misguided about this, but it does seem to me that it is possible to redefine the intellectual in terms of those five qualities. So the intellectual, the public intellectual, is contrarian, is willing to make a case for pluralism to protect the university against corporatization or state control, and so on. This is, as I see, the role of the intellectual. And of course, it's a much more modest self-understanding that's indebted to a much older meaning of the wisdom of experienced people in the world.
I'll pass you now one question from some of the people. Jordi Ferrer asks, to what extent do you consider how the expertise is increasingly subject to the influence of mediatization, or in other words, to the popularity measured by the digital media performances, has been transforming this phenomenon especially in terms of fake performance expertise. For instance, in the pandemic era, the controversial approaches by virologists, epidemiologists, data analysts, and so on.
Yes. I mentioned the Tetlock, the work of Philip Tetlock, and which is about this problem, that the temptation of experts to go public, to use social media, to have a visible, striking presence on television, radio, and so on, is potentially destructive of those 5 qualities of being an expert. Take this one point about the self-doubt of the expert. You know, when I think of experts, I think of Wittgenstein's Übergewissheit, on certainty, where there's one, it's one of the last works that he wrote, there's one aphorism where he said, imagine a world where it was forbidden to say, I know. And instead, we were only allowed to say, I believe I know. Well, a lot of journalists, media platforms are not interested in people who say, I believe I know. They like bold statements that are sensationalist, that turn heads, that catch eyeballs. And the great trap here, I think, that is faced by experts is the trap of fame, of celebrity status. And every person listening and watching at the moment can no doubt think of at least one character who fancies themselves as an expert who has actually been damaged by celebrity. This is not old-fashioned hostility to journalism. It is rather an appeal that I'm making to protect those qualities of the expert, and to be aware of those qualities when one goes on radio or television or when one tweets. Those qualities are, as I've tried to say, functionally vital for a democracy.
Yeah, but it seems to be there's no alternative than to present experts, you know, in front of the people, except by the media, right? And so in the end, I mean, it's almost unavoidable that they turn to be celebrities. You know, we have a very famous case in Spain. There's also another one in Germany. I think the Spanish one has been far more criticized than the German one. And then on the other hand, there's this accusation that they are really being, so to say, they're not really representing science. They're representing a government position, you know, and so somehow there's a mix-up between the political interests and I mean the management that they make of their so-called expertise, right?
Yes, I think that's so. But you know, let me mention because I haven't given examples. Again, Petr Piot, I think he handles. He plays the role of the expert in the field of virology very well. And although he is constantly in demand on the media, he is someone who, for example, emphasizes, to repeat, that we know actually very little about the viruses that we study. He is, as you may know, the person who discovered, named Ebola. Or I could mention Carlo Rovelli, the Italian quantum physicist, you know, who has lots to say about the tricky status of reality or has disturbing things to say about orthodox understandings of time, and does it in an animated, almost self-ironic way. I believe that it's possible to nurture, to spread these virtues of expertise in and through media. One has to watch out for the celebrity trap.
Certainly. Here's another question, which might be contentious, because Alba Requejo suggests that, thinks if it could be possible to, in a certain sense, to establish supervision of certain opinions that are discretionary in social media, by filtering or banning certain comments while respecting freedom of speech. So is it possible to respect freedom of speech and, on the other hand, if I have interpreted rightly the question, on the other hand, establish, let's say, a certain censorship of comments or of opinions that are by far conspiratorial or outside of any belief in truth, even, right?
I think we should probably pass this question to Mark Zuckerberg. Comments. It is emerging as a very major question at this stage of the unfinished digital communications revolution. We are aware, I tried to write about this in my media decadence book. We are aware that the transformation from a broadcasting model to a digital networked, multi-platformed type of communication enables lies and conspiracies and bullshit, and of course hate speech, aggressive narratives to proliferate. And the time is coming in which the regulation of this kind of aggressive, anti-democratic speech, the time is coming where it will be regulated, and already there are early signs of this. I was always, just a tip here, I think experts, to be clear, experts, as I have defined them ideotypically, are not perpetrators of aggressive, hateful narratives. This would openly contradict the ethos of democracy, a political form, a way of life in which the dignity of all is respected, to put things roughly. So in everything that I had to say, the expert is not, the expert can cause trouble, the expert does cause tensions, it does stir up public controversies, but it does not, the expert does not, functionally speaking, perpetrate aggressive, violent narratives. Those narratives are, for example, in the United States, protected by section, I think it's 293 of a Communications Act, so that Facebook cannot legally be held liable for the hate speech that it circulates. That has to change. And you may know that there is emerging a campaign to force a change. Whether that happens in the Biden administration period, we shall see. But in sum, there isn't, as Stanley Fish, the American literary critic, famously said, there isn't such a thing as free speech. Only in the afterlife would there be free speech, where everything can be said because there is no power, there is no conflict, there is just pure harmony. We live on Earth, and the question of what counts as free speech is a matter of judgment. I think experts can play a role in mediating and moderating that question.
Certainly.
But thank you very much.
Certainly, I do totally agree with that. Javier, would you like to pose a question as well?
Hello, and can you hear me?
Voila.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Keane, and for this great dialogue. I have several questions, but choosing one among them. Well, I think that the importance of experts has to do partially, at least, with the possibility of generating an intersubjective solution to social problems. No? In this sense, one could say that science is playing a very similar role that religion used to play before. But if we take the old conception of expertise, however, this might change. If expertise means wisdom, the views of experts are likely to be much more context dependent, rooted in local history, since every political community has its own trajectory with its own successes and failures. Do you think that this political landscape is compatible with our current challenges, global challenges, such as climate change, with at least in my view, need global coordination? And very related to this, you developed a very interesting theory of the relationship between government and experts, but what is your vision of the relationship among contradicting experts, particularly vis-a-vis global challenges?
Gracias for this pretty large world historical question. Questions in one. I mean, I would love to discuss it in detail, but what I think is captured, Javier, in your two questions is that in these years of the 21st century, I think globally there is a rising anxiety about the future. It's not only carbon emissions and rising temperatures and the storms, the droughts, the wildness of weather. There is species destruction. There is a mounting concern about chemicalization of the biosphere. There is, I would say, rising, deepening anxiety also about the social and political effects of all of this. A rising sense of the growing indeterminacy of life. Now, of course, millions and millions of people live their lives without being haunted by these concerns. They get up in the morning, they brush their teeth, they have breakfast, if they have enough food, they are with their loved ones, and so on. But I think this mounting anxiety is also generating signs of catastrophism. This apocalyptic great Black Death view of the world. And it does seem to me that it's in this sense that expertise, your questions correctly point to the point that expertise is of rising importance in negotiating this anxiety and playing the role of doubter, contrarian of the apocalyptic tendencies. Every scientist whom I have met in the last several decades, for instance, in a project on Antarctica that I led, will say, not arrogantly, things like, I have spent my life working on this subject, for example, whales or plankton or moss. And I have the creeping feeling that I know less now than I ever thought I did. That is, there is a skepticism, a sense of wonder, a willingness to admit that what we are doing to the biosphere may end in catastrophic consequences, but we don't yet know. We should, therefore, be cautious. So the expert plays the role of the champion of precautionary thinking. I think precautionary thinking is very important for democracy, and I have tried to, in my work, to redefine why democracy is a good thing in terms of its ability to promote precautionary thinking and ways of being in the world. So that roughly is how I would reply to your very important point. It would be a longer discussion as to how experts should handle governments, but very much, I think, in terms that I've just sketched. And yes, there is context dependency, but yes, you've put very beautifully the point that experts are engaged in the business of intersubjectivity. I mean, their duty is to communicate with others. That, I think, was one of my 5 functions, that there is an engagement with publics, where the expert is not God on earth, is not a replacement for the priest, but is someone who brings certain wisdoms, precautionary thinking, advice to publics in defense of the cultivation of wise citizens. If I may, just one long sentence about wise citizens. In my work, I have tried to point out that the informed citizen ideal, it's born of the last quarter of the 19th century, belongs to the old paradigm of the expert as the monopolist of knowledge. I'm not sure if you're aware, but it was in the United States that the informed citizen, it sounds like a great ideal, but the informed citizen was first deployed to disenfranchise blacks. Black people were lost the vote after the Civil War on the grounds of their ignorance, their illiteracy. So the informed citizen was part of that sort of John Stuart Mill tendency to give more votes to people like us, 6, than unskilled workers. I think that the concept, the ideal of the informed citizen is questionable. I think it belongs to the old paradigm, and I much prefer wise citizens. And I think you are right to point out that the expert has a mandate, a duty, a responsibility to cultivate that wisdom of citizens, to encourage them to live their lives knowing that they don't know everything and that others don't know everything also.
Thank you very much, Professor.
John, we have perhaps too many questions, but I'll try to make a selection because we don't want to keep you up so much longer.
It's only 6 o'clock in the morning.
It's only 6 o'clock in the morning, right? No, I was hoping that you could get back to bed, right, and sleep at least another hour. Okay, so this is Carlo Alberto Ciaralli, I guess it's pronounced like that. And he says, in your opinion, what is the most relevant impact of expertise on contemporary politics? Are we in the presence of a radical change in some fundamental category of public law and politics? And like everyone else, he thanks you for your attention and for this interesting conference.
It's a very
broad. Yeah, no, that's.
And all I want to say in reply to the fundamental question is that politics, it seems to me, was always present in my defense of the expert and expertise. Of course, there are different understandings of politics. We can refer to politics as what goes on at upper levels of state institutions. Experts in this sense have a great role to play in relation to state power in that narrow sense of politics. But politics, Hannah Arendt reminded us, also means public life, public controversies, public debate. Experts play a really important role in that, or should do so. But we also, thanks to the rebirth of feminism, the personal is political, or the work of Michel Foucault, we have a third understanding of politics as to do with the body, as to do with daily life, as to do with the power relations that are inherent in how we be in the world on a daily and nightly basis. And here too, experts play a very important role in defending institutional pluralism, in contrarianism, in stirring up public debate, in propagating virtues of humility, and forcing themselves to be more humble. So I think in all three senses, interconnected senses of politics, the expert is of fundamental importance in a democracy.
Okay, thank you. One more question. Here, Javier Mendez says that experts and expertise can become an ally of dictatorships as a way of justification when in a particular time or situation, democracy is not the best solution. Well, I guess those are fake experts, right?
Well, yes, it would follow from my remarks that that knowledgeable, experienced people in any given field who collaborate unquestionably with power that is predatory ceases to be an expert. They become something else. They become technicians of power. They become figures of the kind described at great length in the lectures of Michel Foucault. You know that the whole of Foucault's work is about getting at the way that European modernity invented experts in the old sense, those who know in, say, the field of medicine or psychiatry, who know about human nature and who are prepared to engage in experiments with, force confessions of their victims. Of course, every existing despotism, I have just published a book on the new despotisms of the 21st century, every despotism contains technocrats, figures of this kind who collaborate with power. That, for me, is a violation of expertise. And of course, as I said in my opening remarks, this problem of collaboration with arbitrary power by the knowledgeable is a very old problem under modern conditions.
Yeah, then we have here, this would be the last question. So we have two questions by Fernando Revuelta, and I think we can make it one, in the sense that he has certain misgivings regarding the idea that experts are not really representative of the people. I mean, they have influence, but you know, they have no connection to the will of the people, really. And experts represent themselves in that sense, so that they what he says is, can they be truly democratic as long as not everyone has the same right and opportunity to education, so that it's they are aristocrats of knowledge, so to say, right? And this goes this runs counter to the basic principle of democracy.
Well, this is the populist objection to expertise. That the expert, typically well-trained, well-fed, well-clothed, of more than modest income with a secure pension and so on, is an enemy of the people. I mean, here, it's a theme of the whole series that Professor Valles has put together so wonderfully. Here, we would need a long discussion about democracy and the people. I, in my writings, have tried to historicize that understanding of democracy as the rule of the people, by pointing out that actually we're living in a period where there's been a deconstruction of that sovereignty people principle, in no small measure because of a history of abuse of the sovereign people principle by so-named Democrats. Demagogy is one consequence of that principle. And I am very struck, and I have tried to write about the 1940s discussion of the future of democracy, where talk of the sovereign people principle was widely condemned because of its fascist potential. So democracy, as I understand it descriptively and normatively, is a political form, a way of life where there is power sharing, where flesh and blood people in all of their diversity do vote, but under conditions of monitory democracy are also, they have inputs into, and they are protected by countervailing institutions in which there are experts who defend them against arbitrary power. You know, imagine a democracy where there was no longer Amnesty International, where the whole issue of where a body, a networked global body, whose job is to monitor arbitrary detention, torture, violence against the body of children, of women, of men, and so on. Imagine that such bodies that contain experts who are experienced at data collection and who go into the field and who are able to write and broadcast their findings, who are contrarians, who have a public obligation. Imagine a world where there were no such monitory bodies. Well, it would be, I would say, a fake democracy and a very dangerous democracy. So these remarks were designed to put a big question mark over the sovereignty of the people principle. Try not to think of democracy in that way, because it's descriptively inaccurate. That's not the way democracies function. They function today, and when they function well, they give voices to experts, multiple experts, who help bring democratic gifts to that democracy. It's paradoxical, but it seems to me of very fundamental importance. Populism in action has destructive anti-democratic consequences. This, I think, is becoming clear about this populist, this so-called new populist wave. If you look at the damaging effects on power-sharing constitutional democracy of Trump, it's very clear. And it ended, of course, in a violent episode. Populism sounds democratic because it speaks the language of the sovereign people, but it's actually destructive of expertise. This, I think, is a point that we all agree on. The question is whether expertise is, as you represented, aristocrats of knowledge, or whether expert and expertise can be understood in quite different ways, which I have tried to suggest. But gracias for this.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. I think you ended with a perfect maxim, right? And okay, we're really thankful. We're very sorry that we had to wake you up that early, and we'll keep in touch. Thanks a lot. And thanks also to everyone else that participated in this quite interesting conversation.